So, welcome back to our podcast. Dr. Tim Anderson, all the way from Sydney. As most people will know, Tim's an academic, he's a writer who offers very critical anti imperialist perspectives on US foreign policy in particular. In his work, you have a tendency, like ourselves, to challenge the dominant narratives on mainstream media, particularly on Yemen, Iran, and Cuba, more recently. And while the Zionist controlled mainstream media frames their government's resistance as acts of aggression and terror as well, we anti imperialists know and we salute the legitimate right to defence against US hegemony and US terrorism. So you've written an awful lot about Yemen, about Iran, about West Asia, and also about Cuba. And today, the intention is that we look at the latest rapidly shifting political realities in West Asia and the Caribbean as well. So, the first question I put to you, Tim, is like if we're looking at Yemen's strategy and regional alliances, you, in one of your articles I read last month, were talking about, that it was very distinct from Iran's, and yet Yemen gets accused as being a proxy of Iran's as well, and that the axis of resistance faces this unprecedented pressure that we're now seeing, particularly since the collapse of Syria. So tell us, in your opinion, how has Yemen's strategic ability changed or progressed, particularly in recent days and weeks?
Okay, thank you, Roshin. Look, to start with, Yemen is a very important country in terms of Arab traditions and Muslim traditions. It's at the base of the Arabian Peninsula. Yemen and, the Queen of Sheba and all sorts of historical figures are mentioned in the Quran, and the links to the Prophet Muhammad and so on are very deep. So they have a revolution which is unrecognized in the world, really, except for by the Islamic Republic of Iran and briefly by the Assad government in Syria. But Assad, before his fall, withdrew that, trying to please the prospective investors from the Saudis and the Emirates and so on. So in any case, Yemen is the only successful revolution arising out of the so-called Arab Spring. The Arab Spring spawned these type of color revolutions, which led to the disaster in Libya and the fake revolution in Lebanon, and then the collapse of Syria and the horrific situation that Syria finds itself in now. I visited Syria a lot until 2 years ago, and I'm still in touch with people in there, and it's a terrible situation there, really, to have a regime that is literally an Al-Qaeda regime and carrying out arbitrary violence and imprisonment and torture every day. Really, there's one site on, it's not reported at all, basically, but there's one Telegram group called Syria Justice Archives, run by a character who's outside Syria at the moment, but he's documenting the daily atrocities going on in Syria. And it's not just it's mainly against minorities, but it's not just against minorities, it's against anyone that effectively they feel is some sort of threat to their regime. So anyway, I'll put aside Syria for a moment. Yemen then actually had a real revolution in 2014. It had similar sort of demonstrations and a type of a protests and so on in 2011 at the time of the so-called Arab Spring, and to some extent influenced by events in Egypt and other places. There was also the involvement of Muslim Brotherhood groups in that, and they have had a type of an ambiguous relationship with the process in Yemen. But what eventually emerged is very poorly understood, because the entire UN Security Council, and I write about this in the book that we published earlier this year, the entire UN Security Council, with over a few years and with the one abstention by Russia and no dissent from anyone, and even Venezuela was on the council at that time, decided to impose economic sanctions, so as opposed to the unilateral sanctions that are, or the unilateral coercive measures that are imposed on other countries like Cuba, for example, which are not sanctions in a sense of international law. The ones on Yemen are indeed backed by international law, and therefore that's the intractability of the siege on Yemen is a very terrible thing, basically, and the misnaming, really the abuse of the revolutionary government in Yemen by calling them Houthi rebels, as though rebels were able to construct hypersonic missiles and drive the US Navy out of the Red Sea. That's usually beyond the capacity of rebels. Indeed, the Ansarallah-led coalition, which includes the General People's Council, has been running a revolutionary government for 12 years there now. As I said, only recognized by Iran, supported financially by Iran, in a very good alliance with Iran, but their religious inspiration is quite distinct from Iran. They're not Shia. Some people call them a branch of Shia, but really it draws on a tradition called Zaydism from Imam Zayd, and it has some strong parallels with the Shia tradition. That is to say, a strong ethos of opposing corrupt rule and corrupt rulers, basically, and drawing on the traditions of Imam Ali and Hussein, who was martyred at Karbala, 1400 years ago. So they say that their tradition predates the revolution in Iran, basically, and they are very close to Iran. They're influenced by Iran, but they don't have this sense of what they call 12 Shias, that they believe that there were these 12 imams, and the 12th one is a hidden messiah who's going to come back at a certain time in history and so on. They don't believe in that. They don't believe in they do have the tradition of the Sayyidah, that is to say, the descendants of the Holy Family, of the family of Prophet Muhammad. They have that. And the Houthi family, where was the beginnings of the Ansarallah movement, and which created a thing called the Quranic Project back in the early part of this century. They are, said to have a lineage to the Prophet Muhammad, and therefore Sayyid and Sayyidah, the women. But they don't believe in the infallibility of those people, or Sayyids. So in other words, that undermines the accusation that's sometimes made that they're trying to establish a religious regime. They don't believe they're very religious, they're extremely religious, but they don't believe in, in the infallible religious leaders, basically. And they believe in opposing religious or political leaders who inflict injustice. So they have a parallel tradition of pursuing social justice to the Shia tradition, which of course is rooted in the martyrdom of Hussein in Iraq, in southern Iraq, 1400 years ago, and the idea that you stand up for your principles, whatever the cost, and at the cost of your life. So that's in the Shia tradition, and the Zaydi tradition, from which the Ansarallah movement comes from, Ansarallah, followers of God, is as a similar ethos there, basically. I've written about it in the book. I think, Roisin, you have digital copies of my book. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, we did.
Anyone?
We shared them. Yeah.
Yeah, we have that. We have that book in. It's really, there's about, I think, 14 authors there. Most of them are Yemeni. Some of us are non-Yemeni there. It's available in English now. We've got digitally, and we've got printed copies, and the Arabic version's done. And the Italian version has just been done by the lovely Roberta Rivolta, who was traveling to Syria for many years. And she's a English-Italian translator. So she's organizing this little trip that I'm doing to Italy in September. And I hope that our friends in Greece are going to do a Greek version, and we're going to have a Spanish version too, because one of the missions that I have really from my Yemeni friends at the moment is to, first of all, educate our friends about Yemen and its history, because there's such a lot of distortions. You can imagine, given that virtually no government in the world recognizes it, and everyone calls the revolutionary government Houthi rebels, then we don't have the benefit of Russia or China or Cuba or any of the progressive states actually recognizing Yemen. So therefore, there is this sort of perpetuation of an idea that there is some sort of destabilizing force that's being suppressed by these UN sanctions, when in fact it amounts to a siege on at least 75% of the people in Yemen, because ignoring the desert, if you look at the maps, they're misleading, because most of eastern Yemen is desert, basically over towards Oman. So most of the people are in the north and the western side, basically. So about 75% of the populated areas, a few as I've calculated, are now under the rule of the Ansarallah-led coalition. And I mentioned the General People's Congress. That was the opposition to Ansarallah originally, and it was the party that Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was the former president, who was overthrown in the revolution, and then Ansarallah brought him back into government. And they had also a guy called Bin Habtour as prime minister for about 7 or 8 years. He was an opposition guy too. So you can see that far from being a clan government, it's actually quite a flexible coalition led by, it's a movement, it's a revolutionary movement. So it's not a bourgeois liberal democracy, but they have included, so far as possible, everyone in that coalition who subscribes to the basic ideas. And I mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood. They were in opposition, that is to say, supported by first the Qataris, who are the main Persian Gulf monarchy, which supports Muslim Brotherhood networks, and also some of the others, and Turkey. But they were kicked out of Yemen some years ago when the Saudis had a spat with them. And then you recall the Saudis had a spat with the Emirates also a couple of years ago and kicked the Emirates out of the occupied part of Yemen. So the whole occupied part of the south and the western desert and parts of this a part of the central city there in the center of the desert is an occupation basically sponsored by the Saudis since the Emiratis have gone. They even controlled the World Heritage listed Socotra Island, which is a couple of 100 kilometers south of Yemen, which was the Israelis and the Emiratis would bring tourists from Europe to go and visit Socotra, because indeed it's a remarkable place. It's an extraordinary place. It looks like you're on another planet or something. It looks like the Avatar movie, with strange plants you've never seen, basically. Anyway, when the Emiratis got too big for their boots and the Saudis kicked them out, the Saudis had to evacuate all of those Europeans, hundreds of them, from Socotra Island, basically. But the Saudis got very jealous because the Emiratis, having the most open and formal relationship with the Israelis, were involved in this sort of business dealings, trying to expand the part of Yemen that they controlled effectively. Began with what was still called the Southern Transitional Council. But they also got involved with the Israelis in some level of colonization in the Horn of Africa and support for that terrible, brutal group in Sudan, and supporting the Israelis trying to succeed a part of Somaliland, which is a region in Somalia, and create an Israeli base in the Horn of Africa. So there are actually a lot of Africans in Yemen. If you go there and you look at the coastal areas in particular, there's quite a lot of Africans. Historically, most of them have come from Somalia, basically. Anyway, the Emiratis' collaboration with the Israelis, which wasn't in itself objected to by the Saudis, but the Saudis felt the Emiratis were really becoming too big. The Saudis have always thought that they run the Arabian Peninsula. That's why they themselves don't want an independent Yemen. It's also why they, from time to time, try to bring the other GCC regimes to heel. They helped Bahrain crush the democracy movement in the Arab Spring. Now that's resurging, by the way. Bahrain is one of the parts in the Persian Gulf where there's a great popular celebration of the Iranian strikes on the US military facilities in Bahrain, which has been home to one of the big naval bases of the US there, basically. And Qatar, which was the host to the so-called CENTCOM, that is to say the Pentagon's office in that part of the world, where they supposedly control the whole of what they think of as the Middle East and what the Iranians and others call West Asia. That CENTCOM office has moved to Florida now because the heat's got a bit too much in the Persian Gulf with the Iranians striking back at them, basically. So they've been moving their assets in other places, to Jordan particularly, and the Iranians have followed them to Jordan, smashing them in Jordan, basically, or smashing their radar, trying to destroy the remnants of their defense so their next generation of missiles can finally finish off the what's left of the US bases in the entire region, not just in the Persian Gulf, but also in Jordan, also in Israel. It's even created a spat, by the way, with the Israelis. I don't know if you've noticed this, but the Israelis have had a little bit of a spat with Washington because one of the ministers there, I forget which one it was, Katz or one of them, didn't want the US refueling planes to come and be parked in Ben Gurion Airport in occupied Palestine because he surmised correctly that it was going to make it a target for the Iranians. The Iranians would come back and smash Ben Gurion Airport to get rid of the refueling planes, because that's one of their main targets now, is because all of the short range attack planes need to be refueled. The distance is so great. So they're either getting refueled from refueling planes in Saudi Arabia or on the aircraft carriers or in Jordan or in Israel, or perhaps they're going across into the Mediterranean a little bit more, where that lame aircraft carrier, what's it called, Gerald Ford, I think, has been in Crete getting a year of refitting after they blocked up the toilets and the laundry caught fire, and no one's really telling the true story about what happened there, basically. But anyway, all of this means that as you know, Trump can't get himself out of this war with Iran. He was persuaded into it by Netanyahu and the Israelis. The Israelis love the idea that the US is fighting Iran by themselves. They've made it very clear they don't want to be part of any sort of force to invade Iran. They would like others, like the silly Kurdish separatists in North Iraq, to go and do the job for them. Trump is inclined that way too, because Trump is very fearful of the visibility of a lot of US casualties. He's actually getting quite a lot of casualties now. They're hiding them. We know that a lot of the US media has been revealing that the casualties are much higher in the Persian Gulf, in Kuwait in particular, and also now in Jordan. Some are being killed in Jordan, or in those air bases in Jordan. So Trump doesn't want, the visibility of him losing, not just losing control of the Straits of Hormuz, but also losing young lives for the sake of a war which is widely believed now, even in the US, to be driven by the Israeli interests, basically. So apparently Trump and Netanyahu overruled that minister, and now the refueling planes are going to go to Ben Gurion Airport. So fun and games. The Iranians will have some new targets, because the Iranian priority, I'm sorry, I'm diverting a bit from Yemen, but as you see, it's increasingly interlinked. The Iranian priority at the moment is to destroy all of those assets that are enabling strikes on southern Iran, basically. So it's about the strait at the moment. The Straits of Hormuz is the main focus there. So they haven't been smashing the Israelis at the moment because they're trying to knock out the radar and the other US military assets that are being used to attack the southern cities and the installations, and also some in the north. They've attacked a couple of bridges in the north. They've been attacking some other civilian infrastructure in Iran, basically. So the priority at the moment has been Qatar and Kuwait, and then Jordan, basically. But if the US assets are being moved further back, further west into the Israeli territory, then of course the Iranians will pursue them back there. I think they'll pursue them back to Cyprus too, if it comes to that, because I don't think they're concerned about the idea of there's some ambiguity about whether the British base in Cyprus is protected by NATO, but I don't think it is in the case of if it's involved in aggressive activity. So anyway, yeah, that's a little bit of context there. The Yemenis in this context have held back for a while, you may have noticed, but they have been talking to the Iranians. They've been supported by the Iranians, as Hezbollah was. I think I told you some months ago that when I was in Lebanon June last year, some insider told me that there was something like 1,000 Iranian advisors helping rebuild Hezbollah, which had suffered significantly in that first war. And you saw how Hezbollah was able to come back with significant capacity, some new weapons, cruise missiles, those optic fiber drones, which were doing devastating damage to the invading Israelis there. So there certainly was a restoration of Hezbollah capacity, including the security of their communication capacity, which was breached in 2004. So they were doing that. They've been advising the Yemenis for a while, and the Yemenis on their own initiatives have been creating these weapons. I had the advantage of having a tour through the Anti-Imperialist Museum in Hodeidah, which is in the coastal city west of the capital. If you go to Yemen, go to Hodeidah in the Anti-Imperialist Museum, because it begins with the Second World War, right? And then it goes through, Indochina, Korea, Vietnam, and then eventually it gets to the Arab world, and then, Lebanon and all of the, the Iranian Revolution and so on. It goes through all that up until the Red Sea operations, when they started to, very soon after the truce with the Saudis, which means basically the Saudis had admitted defeat, because the Yemenis, during the long dirty war, between 2014-15 and 2022, by the way, that was initiated because the Ansarullah was about to take over Aden, and that created a lot of anxiety amongst the Saudis and the US. Of course, the US is controlling the Saudis. The Ansarullah, like Hezbollah, has made it very clear that the US is the organ grinder, and the other ones are the monkeys, basically, operating under the US. So that war began to prevent Ansarullah taking over Aden back in 2015. Anyway, eventually the capacity of the Ansarullah forces and the revolutionary government were able to hit the airports they hit the airport in Dubai, they hit the oil facilities in Jeddah, they were hitting other sites in Saudi Arabia. So effectively, they started to impose themselves on the Persian Gulf Arab monarchies, basically, and the Saudis and the mercenaries weren't working for them, basically, after a period of time. The Yemenis were very, by the way, I just mentioned, they're very sensitive about this. A lot of the mercenaries were coming from Yemen itself, because there's a lot of poor people there. Economically, the country has been devastated by more than a decade of siege, basically. And I wasn't able to repeat a visit to Yemen because when I arrived in February last year, the Israelis had already bombed Hodeidah port, and oil was coming in through Ras Issa, a port north of Hodeidah there. But all of the gantries on Hodeidah port had been knocked out by the time I got there. And some of the planes in Sana'a airport were knocked out. They almost killed the head of the WHO. What's his name? The African guy. There was a visiting WHO delegation there. They attacked the airport. There was when I flew in from Jordan in February 2025, I saw the 2 destroyed planes on the tarmac there, but there was still some civilian traffic coming into Sana'a at that time, coming from Egypt, coming from India, and coming from Amman in Jordan, which was the first possibility, the first opportunity I got to visit Yemen. But then when we tried to arrange a group to visit again in June that year, when the 12-day war happened with the Israelis and Iran, the Israelis bombed all of the civilian fleet in Sana'a airport, knocked them all out. So the planes weren't available for Yemenis, let alone foreign people going and visiting Yemen, basically. So they still haven't restored the capacity of their civilian fleet there, basically. But you would also have seen, perhaps recently, that there were Mahan Airlines in Iran managed to do at least a couple of flights from Tehran to Sana'a. Now, part of that was bringing some injured people, civilians who'd been getting treatment in Iran, back to Yemen, and taking a Yemeni delegation to the funeral of Sayyid Ali Khamenei. You may have seen that at the time. Interestingly enough, Mahan Airlines had just got 2 or 3 Boeing aircraft from the Saudis, which is rather interesting, because how would Iran be getting aircraft from the Saudis when the Saudis were the main lieutenants of the blockade, the siege on Yemen? And furthermore, it's US technology, and the US is the most vehement about imposing these and maintaining these sieges, as we've seen with Cuba, for example. So there seemed to be a breakthrough there, one that the Saudis, maybe it was part of that interregnum where the US was taking somewhat seriously the MOU, the agreement, the truce agreement, basically, and perhaps that, and remember that the part of that was compensation for the damage done to Iran, and we know that Trump is obviously going to force the Persian Gulf monarchies, which are the US slaves, basically to pay that compensation. So in other words, he'd be getting the Saudis and the Emiratis to do the paying, basically. And maybe these aircraft that went to Mahan Airlines were part of that deal. I don't really know. But in any case, it was the beginnings of cracks in the siege there. And then the Mahan Airlines, I don't think it was the Boeing, I think it's some other aircraft they already had. The Mahan flights to Sana'a struck a chord. All of a sudden, something was happening there. Since then, the Saudis have claimed that they're reimposing the blockade, and they bombed Sana'a airport again. And then, as a result, the Ansarullah revolutionary government has declared that they're going to impose a blockade on all of the Saudi airports. So there's a tit for tat going on there now, basically, because and the Yemeni authorities are saying, understandably, we're not going to accept that anyone can arbitrarily impose a siege on our country, which is killing our people and not allowing them access to certain essential things, including healthcare, for example. Because, as I said, the situation in Yemen is rather difficult, very difficult, really. The Cubans would say complex or complicated. They avoid saying difficult, but actually it's difficult. It's really difficult. And there are people begging on the streets in Yemen. It's very poor. But these are the same people that went to the support of Gaza, you recall, in 2022. When they got that truce with the Saudis, immediately they started to put a blockade on the shipping supporting the Israeli regime, basically, and that included the U.S. Navy and an aircraft carrier group that was there. And eventually, while they didn't sink the aircraft carrier, they harassed them so much. And you recall the U.S. was saying that they had to do some sharp U-turns, and a couple of their fighter jets fell off the side of the aircraft carrier. The Yemenis say that they shot them down, but anyway, they lost them. And eventually they got exhausted and they left the Red Sea. So under Trump, in the first few months of the second Trump mandate, the Yemenis effectively drove the US Navy out of the Red Sea, basically. And now the current situation is they say they are imposing this blockade on the Saudis until they lift the blockade on Yemen. And of course, the significance there is with the coordination with I think they've reimposed the blockade on the shipping to the Israeli regime too. For some time, that Eilat port in southern Israel was shut down as a result of Yemeni attacks there. But the significance in terms of the overall, the Hormuz situation was, you recall that Hormuz is really supposedly the gateway for about 20% of the global oil and gas supply. Something more once you start looking at natural gas and fertilizer and some other essential things that are coming out of the petrochemical industry, helium and things like that. And the Bab al-Mandab, the squeeze point of the Red Sea that the Yemenis have firepower over, is about another 7%. So the other 7% is mainly the Saudi oil that can get exported through the Red Sea and down through Bab al-Mandab out into the Arabian Ocean or the Indian Ocean. So that's the current sort of contribution of Yemen to the coordinated campaign of Iran at the moment. And I believe a couple of Saudi ships have already been turned around. They've gone back to the refinery there in Jeddah, basically. So the Yemenis are playing a more active role there now. They're taking it step by step. I think in the early stages of the war, certainly in the 12-day war last year, Iran did not want all of its allies in the region, and while Hezbollah was still rebuilding itself, the Iraqis were ready to help. Yemen was ready to help, but they didn't want immediate escalation at that time because you recall the period of time of several decades in which Ali Khamenei was the leader, and he'd been a popularly elected president back in the 80s. He was a wartime elected president in the 80s when the Saddam Hussein was at the instigation of the US was attacking Iran. So he had experience as a wartime president, and it was his strategy that built up this huge armory of deep underground silos and missile factories and basically putting all their strategic assets, except himself, in those deep protected areas, basically, and avoiding responding to any provocation because they were building up their strength for the big test that was to come. And the big test was the big monster, the big power, the US was going to directly attack them. But they hadn't done that even in June last year. It was the Israelis that attacked them. And then you recall Trump did some brief bombing and declared it was all over, declared he destroyed everything. And so both sides basically went to rebuild their capacity. But once the US began its direct attack on Iran and murdered Ali Khamenei on February the 28th this year, that period which they called of strategic patience ended effectively. Because recall, strategic patience was to build up their strength to face a big test, basically, and avoid that sort of war as long as they could. Well, you see how rather effective that strategy has been for them. And of course, it's embedded in an economic strategy too, which has built up their capacity, their self-sufficiency in many respects. There's a concept called the resistance economy in Iran. The resistance economy was let's make a virtue out of the blockade, effectively. If they're blockading our steel supplies, we'll become self-sufficient in steel and we'll become exporters of steel. And they did that under the so-called maximum pressure sanctions. So in many areas they became, although they still trade and they still want to trade, but nevertheless their economy became rather strong and they built up some capacity that they wouldn't have had, they wouldn't have built up otherwise. And that was that resistance economy and the industrial depth of Iran was, of course, at the root of this military strategy as well, basically. And there's quite a good article written by an Iranian expat woman on this, basically, which brings together the political economy of the resistance economy with how the Iranians actually confronted the latest war. They call it the Ramadan War, the first month of that war this year, anyway. I'll send you the link to that. I haven't got it.
Do you know her name, Tim? No,
Sorry.
I can write down her name. Do you know the name of the?
Look, I'll send it to you on a link when we've
Yeah.
finished it. I'll have to look it up to find it. I've forgotten exactly. But it's interesting that there are some, although you've got such a lot of crazy expat Iranians, the monarchists and Zionists and so on, there are some very sort of apparently non-religious, or you don't pick them immediately as religious people, who are very patriotic. And of course, you've seen that in Iran during the war, basically. The Yemenis, for their part, are going to play an increasingly important part, I think, because the Saudis now have, what's happening to the Arab monarchies in the Persian Gulf is interesting. What Iran is doing effectively is destroying the capacity of the US to have any hosted bases in the Persian Gulf and either further afield, such as in Jordan and in occupied Palestine too. And of course, that poses a dilemma for all of the Persian Gulf monarchies, the largest of which is Saudi Arabia. So what type of accommodations are all of those regimes? Qatar has a very big share of a natural gas field, the South Pass field, part of the South Pass field with the Iranians. The US has attacked that recently. I drove through it in March this year, and we went through at night, and it was like it became daytime because this huge gas field with lots of flames in burning the what do you call it, the remnants that are going out there. It's a huge place, and Qatar has a share in the underwater part of that field with Iran. So Qatar has a lot of economic incentives to have better relations with Iran for its own future, basically. But nevertheless, these are completely unrepresentative, undemocratic regimes. They're family businesses, basically. It's not clear the extent to which any of them can actually reconstruct themselves in a way that a normal state might. When I say normal state, I mean just a normal bourgeois state might make some rational decisions, but really these family dictatorships, like the Saudis and Bahrain and the Emirates and so on, it's not clear to what extent they can break free of that grip there. But and the Emirates are probably the most recalcitrant of all at the moment, basically. But one might have thought a couple of years ago that they were urbane, very sort of secular and so on. If you ever go through Dubai, because Dubai is such a big hub with all of the evils of Western culture in it, basically. But nevertheless, they were the ones of all of them that were closest to the Israelis and closest to these evil strategies in North Africa as well as West Asia, basically. But Yemen has become a more important ally. I think I mentioned to you before that when I was in Yemen, I asked a few people in Ansar Allah, including the guy who was a deputy foreign minister, now the foreign minister, who's very open, by the way, to having talks with people. If you want, we can get him with a translator onto your session if you'd like to talk directly to the Yemeni foreign minister. Maybe you want to ask him some things. But I asked him at the time, I said, listen, has Yemen's role in the region, in the resistance alliance or the axis of resistance become more important since the fall of Damascus? And he said, it's doubled. It's doubled. So they see themselves as having obviously a responsibility for supporting the Palestinian resistance. They would help more the Lebanese resistance if they could. They have good relationships with the Iraqi resistance. They have close relationships with Iran, but they are making most of their own strategic assets. And unfortunately, they're still importing grain, so they have some serious vulnerabilities. They do have agriculture, and it's not a socialist society either. The oil was being imported largely through private companies when I was there in February. And they decided to, instead of getting oil from Iran, which they might have done at a cheaper price, they were buying it from the enemy. They were buying it from the Emirates because they wanted to avoid the complication of ship inspections and accusations that Iranian weapons were coming in ships and so on. So actually, at the time I was there early last year, they were buying oil directly from the enemy after a truce, basically. But then since then, they bombed the Ras Isa, so I don't know exactly what's going on there. But the state has got involved in some economically in some areas like growing wheat, because that's one of their strategic vulnerabilities, basically. And they may get involved more in other parts of what's basically a mixed economy with some serious vulnerabilities, basically. But if you like, I think the foreign minister probably would be open to talking to you. I know that we could put him in contact with some Palestinian activists in Bangkok, in Thailand, and he was ready to talk to them. So I don't see why he wouldn't like to talk to you. What the mission I mentioned that I'm on with the book and so on is to try and talk to some civil society people in some of those states like Cuba, like Russia, like China, and basically educate our friends, because at the moment none of them have any real. There might be some underground talks going on, but there is no state other than Iran that recognizes the revolutionary government, and that creates these terrible weaknesses. The fact that there is still this
Horrific.
blockade.
Yeah. To think that, like, whenever we listen to you talk about everything that Yemen has done, everything that the Yemenis people have sacrificed and continue to sacrifice for Palestine, against US imperialism, and to not have that recognition. But I suppose one of the most shocking things is for people who are maybe new to Yemen is, like you said, that the UN Security Council also endorsed these horrendous sanctions. I want to give you time to take a breath, Tim, because you've been talking a lot there, and maybe Alan, you had your hand up, or let somebody else come in with a comment or a question. Alan, do you still want to speak up?
No, I didn't mean, I don't know how my hand came up.
Oh, that's
So
okay.
no, thank you.
Anybody?
Let me just add one thing,
Yeah.
because you just catalyzed something in my brain. That, for example, with our Venezuelan friends, and Venezuela is a whole other story, which I was trying to improve my education on what happened there when I was in Cuba, because obviously the Cubans are very close to Venezuela and they're horrified by what's happened there. But nevertheless, you recall that for a period of time, the US declared some nobody in exile as the president of Venezuela. And that's part of the reason how the main pretext they used was stealing the Citgo oil company in the US, all of their assets, on 7 billion or something. And the Brits have another billion in gold in the Bank of England, which they didn't want to give back to the Venezuelan government, because they declared some crazy guy who used to be in the National Assembly but wasn't even there anymore as president. Well, this is the argument I'm saying to Venezuelan friends. Listen, if President Maduro didn't want to recognize the revolutionary government in Yemen, why are they recognizing this exile people who are in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, as the government of Yemen? And if you look at all of the Western media now, if you see, the president of Yemen or the government of Yemen says something or other, it's some guy in Riyadh, literally in a five-star hotel in Riyadh. It hasn't even been in Yemen for a decade. There was a guy initially who was an interim president back in 2012, and he retired some time ago. Not even him, it's his successors are in Riyadh claiming to be the government. And how is it that countries like other countries that have suffered this sort of indignity of the ludicrous nature of calling some person in another country the president of or the prime minister of your government? So these are some of the contradictions that I try to point out with some of my Latin American friends, for example. I believe there are some talks going on between Ansarallah and some of the other big powers, really, but there is no government except the Islamic Republic of Iran so far that recognize them as a government. Incredible. And of course, let's remember all of our silly Western imperial left people who celebrate all these color revolutions. They were happy with the color revolution in Libya, but what have they done about the actual real revolution in Yemen? These people are being exposed all the time. I just saw the other day that group that Trotskyist group in New York, basically the USSWP is still openly doing headlines how we have to support Israel against Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. So they're completely, they're the full Monty with US imperialism, while claiming to be anti-imperialist and claiming to support Cuba and so on. And then I saw there was someone else, some young woman on Instagram was saying she went along to one of I think it might have been the same group, some session on Cuba, and they were berating Cuba, saying how terrible Cuba was at a time when Cuba was under attack and, on a terrible threat, terrible siege, a genocidal siege, effectively. Really, there's some extraordinary, strange creatures in the Western so-called left these days. I'm starting to call them the Pol Pot.
Yeah,
basically.
not by accident, as we know. Like you say,
No.
I shared that article because you had posted it on your Instagram page. Like you sometimes hear about it in Ireland, like it's there's a narrative, but to see it published so overtly like that is shocking. I don't even want to say it's shocking. We're saying everything's shocking. We shouldn't be surprised. This is the pattern, and this is the Trotskyite intention. This was always the movement, but to see it in black and white, even the Trots don't go on like that in Ireland. They wouldn't be so brazen as to publish it in the Militant, I think it was, publication.
The Militant, yeah.
Yeah. Tim, I know that again, the contradiction, the Militant support Israel. But let's move to Cuba now, because you've spoken about how it is, again, another example just of the brute, cruel reality of US imperialism that has continued to endure and resist, but in a different kind of way. They do not have what Yemen has, what Iran has. They haven't been able to have even that strategic patience to build up because they've been in survival mode for decades. So let's talk about even your visit to Cuba and I know nobody has a crystal ball to talk about what's going to happen, but even is there any possibility that what has happened to Venezuela can happen to Cuba?
I don't think so. I think there are certainly people in the Trump regime that would like to move that way. That's the type of coup that they carried out in Venezuela, and that's another story in itself. But we know that the Venezuelan government has betrayed a lot of its principles in the huge surrenders that they've made, including handing over one of the political prisoners, that they fought for many years. Breaching the contracts they had with China. China gave them credit for investment and then was paying the loan with shiploads of oil. The Trump regime said to Delcy, block it, and they blocked it. the Cuban medical mission. There's still a Cuban medical mission in Venezuela. That actually Cubans have sent some rescue missions too after the earthquake, even though the Cubans are suffering themselves. But in those circumstances, it reminds you of Yemen, doesn't it? Really, the Yemenis surprised everyone when, after that 10 years of siege and a war, immediately they came to the aid of the Palestinians. So this is what the Cuban spirit has been for a very long time. I was there in April, May, most of May, basically. I went to the May Day Brigade, the 1st of May, which is always a big thing in Cuba, although because of transport problems, we walked from the Plaza of the Revolution to the anti-imperialist tribunal, which is in front of the US Embassy on the waterfront there. So it wasn't quite the same parade as in other years, but nevertheless, there was 220 odd of us, which is good. Actually, it's a very, there are national groups that go in brigades to do some work experience and so on, and to learn about Cuba. I'd never been on one. I've been to Cuba about 15 times. I'd never actually been on one of those brigades, but I went to this May Day one, and there was a conference after it. The conference was cancelled, so I ended up spending time with friends and doing other things there. But the May Day Brigade's a good one, and there were people from different countries. There was a lot of so you got a mixing of different groups. A big group from Brazil, big group from Germany. From Germany, they were all very young. I mean, really young. 18, 19, 20-year-old, all smoking. All communists, and they all had musical instruments, and they were singing German communist songs, which I wasn't used to, but anyway, it was fun and games. There were a lot of young, enthusiastic people there, and the older communists from Germany, by the way, I didn't realize they have quite a history with some of the projects there. For example, they had helped initiate a neurological center for teenagers in Matanzas, or the place next to Matanzas, at least. So they'd gone in, they'd sent people in work brigades to help them restore this old building, and then they brought in supplies. And the group that I was with were taking in still suitcases full of medical aid and so on, and including suitcases to childcare centres and primary schools with all sorts of student things and so on. So people are literally, taking, household items there because they're missing such a lot in Cuba, basically. But as you pointed out, Roshan, they have experienced shortages for a very long time. They're very resilient people. They've been preparing for an invasion for a very long time. The last one they had was the Bay of Pigs in 1961. You recall when Fidel defeated the US invasion in 3 days, 72 hours. And then, of course, that made the mafia very unhappy with JFK. So when I hear the conspiracy theories about Israel getting rid of JFK, I think, well, the Miami Mafia was in there too. There were a few suspects, So anyway, Cuba has been preparing for a long time. Part of the preparation is they have a very good intelligence system. The fact that we know that the CIA and other US agencies had tried at least 600 times to assassinate Fidel Castro and clearly failed. It was not an accident. It wasn't a coincidence. They were detected, most of these plots, basically. They detected them. Some of them were fantastic, but they found out about them, basically, including the one in Panama in the year 2000. And then, of course, they corrupted the president of Panama and got the assassins out of jail, and they all went back to Miami to live happily ever after, basically. So, but nevertheless, Cuban intelligence is very strong. Remember, Cuba built its state from the ground up. Venezuela overlaid a very progressive semi-revolutionary government on a mixed economy and a bureaucracy which had a lot of corruption. And it seems like there was betrayal. Even the UN Secretary General Guterres said he believes there was betrayal in the Venezuelan case, and it's less likely in the Cuban situation. One, they will see it coming. Two, it's less likely that they're going to be able to corrupt senior figures in the regime there. I know my Chinese friends are concerned about this after Venezuela. People have reason to be concerned about Cuba after what happened in Venezuela. Certainly, what happened in Venezuela is a terrible thing. The Cubans don't want to denounce it. They don't want to talk about it. because the historic relationship between Cuba and Venezuela is very important, basically. And so, in a sense, the line that they're presenting in a way is that, well, they're doing these things under pressure, but privately they don't respect it. The Cuban medical mission is not being compensated in the way that it was. You recall, I don't know if you knew, but the Cuban medical missions are all compensated in different ways. A very poor country, the Cubans will fund it and pay everything. And then if the poor country gets some serious money, they'll ask the poor country to start paying the salaries of the doctors and so on. And then if it's a rich country like Brazil or Venezuela, they'll get them to compensate the Cuban health ministry, which has trained all of these doctors and keeps supporting them and supplying them and so on. And that was like a commercial relationship that Venezuela had with the Cubans for a very long time. But because the Trump regime has said you can't send anything to Cuba, and then not only that, they've threatened every other country. I don't know what's happened with Russia, really. Russia got one shipload of oil in just before I was there in February or March this year. But a second boat was turned around for some reason. The Mexican government, which has been very close to Cuba, very supportive of Cuba, not even just because there's a left-wing president there at the moment, but historically, Mexico has never cut relations with Cuba in all that time that the US was trying to isolate Cuba through the Organization of American States. So the current Mexican government has been sending food to Cuba. China has been sending food, large amounts of rice, large solar panels, which have become the renewable energy in the national electricity grid in Cuba has increased a lot. The number of electric vehicles is substantial in Cuba. It was substantial a couple of years ago. It's even more now. So they're moving in the direction of something they've talked about for a while, but they're under pressure now to be far more self-sufficient in energy and food. They haven't ever been self-sufficient in energy and food. They've been a trading nation. They're a trading nation. They've invested in their people like every successful small island country does. They invest in their people. Japan, Singapore, Cuba, but they've been blocked in all of their the US, particularly Trump, has been trying to stop countries having Cuban doctors there because the Cuban doctors claiming there's some sort of abuse of the Cuban doctors. In fact, every Cuban health professional, I say doctors, but it means other health professionals and nurses and so on too, they make quite a lot of money for themselves. They keep their job at home with the miserable salary that they've got at home, but they get a stipend. Maybe they're getting $50 a month salary at home. They get a stipend, maybe could be $1,000 a month in the country, and then they bring a few thousand back home when they go home, and they get a car or a better house or something like that. So actually, the health professionals benefit from being on those missions, basically. And I'm lucky I'm going to have the opportunity, I think, to visit the 200 or so Cuban doctors are in South Italy, in Calabria, in September. And that one is through a right-wing government, the right-wing regional government in Calabria, basically, which the Trump regime has tried to pressure into getting rid of the Cuban doctors there. And they said, piss off, basically, it's a good deal. We're short on doctors. The Italian doctors want to go and work in the north where the wages are better and so on. And so we're very happy with the Cuban doctors working here, basically, which is a common thing everywhere, by the way. The Cubans, one reason they train so many doctors is they believe there's a worldwide shortage of doctors, and they are committed to training more and more. You think that they would reach some limit, but there's no real limits to it. The way they look at it, really, the limits come in when the local, what do you call them, the guilds of private doctors don't like to see public sector salaried doctors coming in and undermining their lucrative professions. That's how it happens everywhere. It's what happened in South Africa, in Honduras, in Bolivia. They blocked us getting a medical mission in the biggest Pacific island, Papua New Guinea, because there was 300 private doctors, and that private doctors guild had people in the cabinet, and they managed to spread rumors about Cuban doctors not being highly qualified and so on. Every other Pacific Island nation in the South Pacific has got Cuban medical brigades there now, basically, and the huge one in East Timor, of course. So anyway, Venezuela is a different kettle of fish to Cuba now. Cubans are suffering a lot. It's really very difficult. The transport is almost ground to a halt. Not quite. There are some There is some local production of oil apart from the solar panel systems moving into the electricity grid. The Cubans have talked about for at least 20 years that I know of, and they've started now to perforate for the oil in the Caribbean, in the Gulf of Mexico, or what do they call it? The Gulf of Trump or whatever. The Gulf of Mexico, basically. Some of the oil there pertains to Cuba, but they haven't ever wanted to, if they had the capital to do it, to have a floating platform up there. This is a region that gets hurricanes. They've got big fears about oil spills affecting their northern beaches, which is one of their biggest assets. You know, the Keys and Varadero across the north coast, they're beautiful sandy beaches. That's what the tourists come for. The tourists are way down at the moment in Cuba. Really, you could go to a lot of places in Old Havana and elsewhere, and very few tourists there, basically, and notably a lot of Cuban Americans who are really becoming one of the bigger groups. That I'm exaggerating a little bit because a lot of the foreign tourists now go directly to the Keys. I've looked at figures on it, and the rate of tourism now to Cuba is something like about, by the end of the year, there's going to be about 600,000 tourists this year, 600, maybe 700,000. Before COVID and after the Obama diplomatic breakthrough, they were 4.5 million, and 2 million before that. So they're down to a bit over 500,000 at the moment. It means that a lot of the restaurants, the musicians are not playing because they're not getting paid by the restaurants and so on in Havana. So a lot of the luster is taken off the tourist experience in Havana, for example, because of that lack of tourists. But anyway, so they're trying to protect the beaches. So they are perforating horizontally from the north coast and extracting some of that fuel, which is very heavy oil, like Venezuela, maybe even heavier than the Venezuelan oil. But they've got the capacity to refine it now. They have a refinery in the east in Santiago. They are refining their own heavy oil at the moment. That means to refine heavy oil, you need diluents. You need things like naphtha, and diesel, diluent petrochemicals, which, because otherwise the heavy oil clogs up the refineries. Basically, they've got that. They're doing it now. So there are some. I'm just saying there are some offsetting factors, but by and large, and there's some black market fuel going around that basically, normally the fuel is sold at a set price in the state coupette stations, basically, but most of that is gone, and there's no public sector buses happening at all. Basically, the trucks can't pick up the garbage, so you've got garbage piling up and so on. There are some collective taxis, like the Máquinas, the old US cars. They're electric cars too, but they're not really, their suspension's not that good for long-term transport. A lot of transport around the cities, they've got these three-wheeler electric cars, because China and Spain do have some companies, and with the economic reforms, there's been about 3 big waves of economic reforms, which is sort of Cuba's very modest way of going down the Vietnamese Doi Moi way, the Deng Xiaoping way, but not nearly as far as that, and maintaining social guarantees, maintaining social security for small business people or people employed in small business and so on. So they've done it in a very particular way. But the latest round of it happened just in the middle of this fuel blockade, basically, because it's not so much that the Cuban people will blame the government, but they do expect the government to do something, basically. So the government is trying to do things, trying to mobilize some private capital to avoid starvation, effectively. So they're making some accommodations. This began really in the 90s after the collapse of the oil for sugar deal with the Soviet Union, and then they introduced mass tourism. They started to allow joint venture investment in hotels and so on. Some types of small business that's gradually expanded under Raul Castro 2010. Now recently, again, there's an expansion of small business and also transactions in property, so that you've got a little bit of a rising middle class now, because there's transactions in property where people, through family homes now, people in the past, like from the 90s, it was only old retired people who could rent out private rooms because they didn't have any work. So the pensioners effectively were empowered to into a very lucrative business where you could rent a room for, if you had air conditioning, if you had a good fridge, good facilities and so on, you got registered, then you could rent a room for $25 a night to tourists. That's big money in Cuba, basically, but it was only pensioners that could do it. Then with Raul Castro 2010, they expanded it. Now you've got some absentee landlords who are renting rooms, renting out to private restaurants and so on. Some of them are quite good. So you've got an expansion there. And you also have some of these companies. I mentioned the Chinese companies that sell electric vehicles, the Spanish companies that sell food, for example. No privatization in medical services. There are some things that are held back completely from private business in Cuba, but nevertheless, you have a sort of a type of property transaction, commercial relationships, which has led to the rise of a sort of a property class, a middle class, which has some money and so can survive and get things. You've got increased inequality effectively, and then partly as a result of that, you have an increase in crime and desperate. You've got desperate people, and there are some other people with money. So the locks on houses are increasing and so on. So there's some bad side effects of that. The Latin American phenomenon. Most of Latin America, except Cuba until recently, has been very plagued with terrible crime and violence, basically, because it's a result of long-term inequality, basically. You see the same sort of thing in South Africa. When you have long-term inequality, you breed these cultures of crime and violence. You've got people who've got wealth and some that have nothing, and it's a toxic mix, basically. So unfortunately, some of that sort of stuff is brewing in Cuba now, basically, but they are resilient. They've got strategies in train. They're a solidarity people. They support other people with the basics. You wonder how people can survive in these circumstances, but they do, basically. And there are shortages of, I jokingly say it's half true. There's shortages of everything except rum and ice cream, basically. But there are regular shortages of wheat, which means the government can't provide the subsidized bread rolls that they've been doing for a long time. They've used flour from sweet potatoes to do it, but they've really been lacking in wheat, basically. And some of the South American countries, Uruguay and Mexico, have provided them with wheat recently, but they are really relying on a lot of aid at the moment, basically, until they can reestablish some of their businesses.
Yeah, they're absolutely desperate, from Yemen to Cuba, incredible, but good to get those insights. And there's nothing like actually being on the ground, Tim, and having, seeing with your own eyes what is happening. Thank you.
Well, it's seeing how people resist. I thought, what am I doing in these situations? I thought, well, I'm lucky to be a witness of how people resist, and people resist in different ways in different countries. The same, you could say the same for Iran, but Iran's a big country with a lot of resources. So it's harder to starve and put a siege on a big country like Iran or Russia. Yeah, but certainly they're resisting, and their resilience is tremendous in Iran too.
Yeah, it does. It brings up that very important concept, even, of what is resistance. And for us here in the West as well, what does resistance look like? I don't think we have a clue. Alan, you've your hand up.
I was going to make one small point about this small island and the medical side of things, and the parallel. I was a medical student in the 60s in the South, in Dublin, and you had a situation where you had 3 huge medical schools in Dublin, then in Cork and Galway, and Ireland was massively overproducing doctors, and the Irish people were subsidizing the system, and it was a way of diffusing conflict in the society. The middle classes, their sons and daughters, were shipped all over the world and had a good life, and that paid for by the Irish people. Prior to that, priests were being produced, but that sort of became ground to a halt, and then it became through the universities.
You're not still exporting priests.
Well, they are, but on a smaller scale, and I presume the Irish people are paying for that as well. But there's a way in which Ireland in the 60s sold out. Not that their plan was going anywhere, but they betrayed the original concept of independence, self-sufficiency, and the Irish nation, and started bringing in imperial outside investment and selling the country, which is just plowed on and on and on. So they've behaved very differently to Cuba. I find Cuba inspiring. It's fascinating to try and understand the psychology of the people surviving and the pride they have and what it means for humanity. I think there are lots and lots of things to learn from Cuba and the Cuban people.
Well, you had the famous Irish grandson of Irish people, Ernesto Guevara Lynch, who was a doctor who was exported to Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently he knew a lot about Irish history. When he visited, some people were impressed that he'd actually followed the histories of the Fenians and the independence struggles and so on. He went to Gaza, of course, too, but he did visit Ireland because his mother was a
Irish.
Lynch.
Yeah. It just goes to show you, though, isn't there a lesson there as well, how important, I mean, so many people think that they understand revolutions or revolutionary politics or claim to be anti-imperialist or revolutionary in their thinking, but without that understanding of history, Tim, as well, and understanding the context, like you say, even Alan, of every different country's experience. Um, it's vacuous really, or it's very flimsy kind of revolutionary understanding. I think that, we in the West are seeing, if you were to go by main or just social media, it looks like there's a real flurry of revolutionary understanding and a rising revolutionary consciousness. But you wonder, to what extent is that how strong is that? It seems like a bit of a veneer, actually. Social media has that. I suppose it's designed to do that, to create the illusion of revolutionary understanding. And like, when you say, Tim, that some young communists from Germany came to dance and to sing and to, all of that's very good, but there is to be part of a revolution and to be revolutionary is not glamorous at all, and I think it's being presented to young kids now, who wear Che Guevara t-shirts or whatever, and there's a lot of new pop-up books and pop-up organizations. It's sexy, it's glamorous, it's cool. But the reality is when you look at Cuba, when you look at Yemen, when you look at Iran, you realize that, it is not glamorous, it is not amazing, and it is certainly not cool. Barry has his hand up. I just would like to let Barry come in, Tim, and then we'll come back to you. Maybe we'll round off go back to Iran if that's possible. But first, Barry.
I was just going to ask there, do you think, Tim, is the American empire in any real danger due to the fact that they've clearly overextended themselves? They're clearly not able to win within West Asia. They haven't won any war in history. The rise of China and the strength of China, and to a lesser extent the strength of Russia, plus the rumblings at home in America. Now, I wouldn't give you much for that, but at least there's some dissent. I mean, where are we on the Richter scale in relation to where the American empire stands at this point and their hegemony and influence in the world?
Well, I think we're well down that path, Barry. We're going down that path, and a lot of it is due to Iran, which very few in the Western left have appreciated, I think, the role of Iran. But of course, what's going on with the Strait of Hormuz and linked to the Yemeni control of Bab al-Mandab is a big threat to the petrodollar. That's the next phase in these things. Of course, the BRICS coalition has been exploring ways to avoid the dictatorship of the dollar, basically. And of course, the Russians and the Chinese have both had a strong motivation there. Every country under unilateral sanctions has had a motive to escape the dictatorship of the dollar. I think even it's got to a ridiculous point where at one stage Trump or Rubio was saying those nations, we're going to impose sanctions on those nations that avoid using the dollar. But those sanctions already are banned from using the dollar, like Cuba, for example. They're banned from using the dollar. There's only some countries that have a license to use the dollar, like Ecuador and El Salvador and East Timor, some little countries that have no currency of their own. So point is, we all know that the dollar, the overvalued dollar, it's not like any other currency. It's been propped up by the fact that we all buy the bloody things. Unfortunately, I have to, because if you go to countries that are under siege, you have to carry cash basically, and still, you can use euros, you can use some other currencies, but still the dollar is still there. But it's definitely mainly, but through BRICS using bilateral swaps, it's definitely declining in terms of foreign reserves, and that's a lot to do with China. China and other countries are starting to get out of, I think China at one stage had 2 trillion in dollar reserves, which means US Treasury bonds. So China was propping up the US dollar. Now it's only got 700 or 800 billion or something like that. And Japan has 1 trillion and the Europeans have another trillion. So the thing is, when no one really wants to dump the dollar completely, because everyone holding dollars will lose. Everyone who's got some sort of financial assets will lose if there's a sudden crash in the dollar. But the transaction of oil in the dollar has been a device since the 70s, which has been helping prop it up, basically. So the Iranians are very interested in this because, of course, one of their main priorities at the moment, and you can see it militarily, is they want to kick every last remnant of the US military out of the region, out of the Persian Gulf and out of the entire region, basically. That's been the stated goal for some time. The Yemenis share that objective. We know that there is I know there's some frustration amongst some of my Iranian friends who talk to the Chinese and they want to talk about the petro yuan, and the Chinese back off, because the type of not exactly diplomacy, but really a lot of the Chinese semi-official people are very indirect about confrontation. They don't want to talk up confrontation. They are supporting Iran to defend itself at the moment, as Russia is too, but they don't want to talk up a confrontation with the US themselves, basically. Of course, they're fascinated the fact that Iran is defeating the US in the Persian Gulf. They're learning a lot of lessons. I mean, US allies are having to reconsider things, as well as the US rivals in a way. But of course, the China and Russia are very keen students of what's going on in the Persian Gulf at the moment. And of course, if it's taken the edge off any threats that the US might make against them, the possibility. It's also sending a lesson to people in Taiwan, some of whom are inclined to have better relationships with the People's Republic, and some are separatists. Basically, the separatists are having some cold water poured on their separatist dreams, looking at what's happening in the Persian Gulf at the moment, because they see that the US is not this invincible monster which can take on all comers. Basically the US will be smashed in a war with China. That should be obvious to a casual military observer, basically. So really, what's happening in the Persian Gulf now, if the US is left with no presence in the Persian Gulf at all, and the Persian Gulf family dictatorships are forced to come to some accommodation with Iran, and because most of the oil from there is going to Asia, basically, and the Asians actually have got good relations, most of them have got good relations with Iran, and some of the Europeans have been doing business with Iran to, the French, for example, to get their ships through the straits and so on. So this is another important effect of the failing war in Iran, is that it's splitting NATO. Basically, the Europeans are starting to think, what use is the US to it? The US is creating all these costs, and it's not guaranteeing things for us. It's undermining our energy security and so on. So that whole shift in energy politics, I know there are some people who are still very enamored with the idea that the US is somehow blocking Russian oil and stealing Venezuelan oil and imposing some blockade on Iran. If you look very closely, though, it's not working with Iran. Iran's been selling more oil in the last few months than for the last few years, basically. And now they've got the rail link to China working, even though one of the bridges was bombed. That's been repaired already, basically. So there are some significant resistance economy achievements. And of course, remember, Iran is part of the not just the BRICS, but the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So the economic relationship between Iran and Russia and China is getting stronger, and their economic linkages are getting stronger, basically. So if the US loses its loyal Arab regimes in the Persian Gulf, loses its bases there, and they have some relative autonomy, to use an old Marxist term, if they have some more relative autonomy to pursue relationships with others, then the grip on of the dollar on the oil economy is going to weaken. So I think we're in the middle of a big slide, basically. The US dollar has been weakening at least since the early 80s. We're in the middle of a big slide. I think this is going to accelerate it, basically. And then, we don't know when. I don't expect a sharp collapse, but basically, of course, if there is even a what do you say, an incremental series of cracks and collapses in the power of the acquisitive power of the dollar, all of that debt that the US has is going to come home to roost. The US economy is going to be undermined very substantially. Its capacity to support 800 military bases abroad to intervene in other countries is going to be weakened. It might look worse for some of the states closer to them, like Venezuela, because after all, the US ran Venezuela for a century. Both of the world wars in the last century were fueled. The US military was fueled by Venezuelan oil. That's why they resented so much Chavez and independent Venezuela not providing them with that. They would sell it to them. Chavez and Maduro were selling oil to the US, but they wanted that exclusive access. They wanted to exclude the Chinese. They wanted to exclude Cuba, everyone else basically from it. So I think, in short, I think that the whole Persian Gulf phenomenon at the moment has got some very serious consequences for the future of the petrodollar, and that's the future of the US capacity to be dictator of the world.
Thank you, Tim. Great question, Barry, actually, to end on. And I think we're going to wrap it up now anyway. But you might come back because you touched on the point there, Tim, of, NATO splitting and this tension between NATO countries and how that will also be a good thing for dismantling the Zionist regime, as the Epstein class, as Morandi would call it, or the ruling US imperialist hegemony over the whole world. That can only be a good thing to help accelerate it. But thank you for your time. And I'm not cutting you off, but I'm looking at the time. I'm supposed to be at the US Embassy now demonstrating. So it's hard to do everything. I'm going to leg it. It would be great to keep talking, but you've given us enough of your time, very generous. We're bereft of questions because you've covered it so deeply and so well. I don't even think that there's room, so much to think about. And I think we need that time to go back and maybe, watch this recording again so that the next time you come back, we'll have more questions for you, more probing questions. Maybe they're very general questions, but it's good to have that general, to zoom in, zoom out, and even to remember that Cuba is not a separate thing to Iran or to Yemen. Some people, like to box off these conflicts or these countries as well and say they're not related, and Cuba's socialist and Iran isn't. It's a very reductive, narrow way of looking at things. We'll end the recording there. We might stay on for 5 minutes just to chat about your book launch, but For me, it's important to say thank you, Tim Anderson, all the way from Sydney, from your comrades in the Pat O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum and Social Rights Ireland. We appreciate everything that you're doing, everything that you're writing and exposing. Thank you, and see you soon.
Well, thank you. Very, very nice to see you and talk with you again.